Hello, this is Jerry Morton. Welcome to my podcast series titled Finding My Way, a memoir by Jerry Morton. This is podcast 66, titled 7 Schools. Podcast 66, 7 Schools, is an account of my first year as a school psychologist serving 7 all-black inner-city schools in St. Petersburg, Florida, which were being integrated for the first time. In June 1969, I left the Army searching for a job. Not until that August day, the day before I began working, was I made aware of my assigned schools or that the school system was being integrated for the first time. Podcast 66, 7 Schools. After the Pinellas County, Florida school system had spent the first week of my new position as a master's level school psychologist in staff in-service meetings with all of the other school psychologists, the public schools began serving children. My immediate task was to meet each of the 7 principals and find out what their priorities were. I was confident that they all expected me to evaluate children. But then what? Would they want me to work with each child's teacher to implement my recommendations? Perhaps each principal would want me to do teacher in services on various strategies. Maybe they would just want me to evaluate children and refer them to other services in the system or to outside service providers. I just did not know. Adding to my uncertainty was the fact that the instructing clinical psychologist at Miami University of Ohio had drilled into the graduate students in school psychology that with a master's degree, all a school psychologist could do was administer tests and score them. The master's level people were not qualified to interpret the test results. A doctoral level psychologist was the only one with a skill level high enough to interpret the test scores to school staff, parents, and other relevant parties. Fortunately, I had a doctoral level school psychologist supervising me. I entered the position confident that he was planning to work closely with me in this regard. Another fear I had was that all of the other school psychologists knew more about the practice of school psychology than I did. The experienced school psychologists knew how to function effectively in the real world as school psychologists. I did not. The newly hired school psychologists had either just graduated from their training program or had been working in that or a related field of psychology for some time. They all knew what the state of the art was. I did not. I had been away from graduate school for 3 years in the Army. Granted, 2 of those years were spent in assisting military personnel in developing skills to work with people from other countries who were experiencing great stress. That stress was due to insurgent, counterinsurgent warfare. Working with children in public schools was totally different, I thought. My week with all of the other school psychologists during the mandatory staff and services opened my eyes about several issues. First of all, the seasoned master's level school psychologist always interpreted the test results to school staff, parents, etc. The director of psychological services, the only doctoral level psychologist on staff, was far too busy to go over every evaluation and interpret the results for the master's level people. None of the school psychologists had any significant experience working in all-black schools. All of the seasoned school psychologists were more than willing to spend time with me to assist my adjustment into my new role. All of the newly hired school psychologists possessed a variety of valuable skills that they were willing to share with others. I felt that I had a real team of skilled school psychologists standing with me. One valuable part of the week's in-service for me was a presentation by Charles Matson, Jr. Dr. Matson was a faculty member at the University of Florida. He had been researching the effectiveness of positive reinforcement strategies to assist children with both behavioral and educational issues. His research found the strategies to be effective provided they were implemented correctly. As a result of his research, he had developed a set of easy-to-remember rules for assisting professionals to implement the positive reinforcement strategies with children in the classroom and at home. He called the system RAID. The acronym RAID stood for Rules, Approval, Ignore, and Disapproval. The strategies he explained in implementing RAID made sense to me. If I encountered any situations in which I thought the strategies would be helpful, I would try them. I had something I could recommend to teachers to help with their behavioral problem children. Of course, until you tried something, you never really knew if it would work. It was one thing for a university professor to talk about his research, but would the strategies work in the real world where time was limited, people wanted and needed solutions that worked immediately, and many professionals had already made up their minds as to what the solution to their problems were? For many teachers, the most immediate solution was to transfer the problem child out of their classroom and to a place that was equipped to handle that child. Unfortunately, there was nowhere for a child with a behavioral problem to go. The school system had a special education center, but it was for children with very serious problems such as significant brain damage, extensive physical limitations, or extremely low intellectual functioning. Other than this resource, there were no clear options to serve children with learning or behavioral issues. It wasn't like there were any state or federal laws mandating special education services for children with dyslexia, moderate autism, a diagnosable emotional disorder, etc., etc. If the classroom teacher could not effectively work with these disabled children, there were just a few options. The children could be denied entrance to the public schools before they ever attended. They could be expelled from school for inappropriate behaviors for whatever length of time was determined to be appropriate, including forever, or they could simply drop out. Once those children were fixed and ready to enter or re-enter school at their correct grade level and could function at the rate of learning that the classroom material required, they would be allowed into the school system. In short, in the fall of 1969, there just weren't many options for the host of caring teachers, school principals, and support staff in providing assistance to troubled students other than doing what could be done in the school building. The RAID program just might be a tool that I could use to help staff members provide needed assistance to their troubled children. I hoped I could make it work the way Dr. Matson said it would work if there was a need for it. Well, my first task was to introduce myself to the principals of my 5 elementary schools, the junior high school, and the high school, and then find out how they wanted to utilize the skills I had to offer. Naturally, all of the school principals were black. These were their schools. They were in the principal's community, the black community. I was the outsider. I was one of the white staff members being sent to their schools. Every school had some white teachers who were forced on them. Each school had lost some of its black teachers. They had been sent to some white school in another part of the county. On top of that, this integration thing was very disruptive to both the black and the white communities. There were other tensions. For example, the anti-integration protesters, including the local chapter of the KKK, often made the headline news. The telephone "bomb in the school" calls were so common in some of my schools that those schools just treated them as a prompt to having a practice fire drill rather than reporting the threats to the local news outlets. Nothing seemed able to stop the federal government's enforced integration of the schools. Again, I just couldn't get over the fact that this school system had been allowed to let school segregation go on so long. I was grateful to be a part of correcting this injustice, even though my part was just a tiny piece of the process. During my time in the Army, I had felt guilty that I was not part of the country's civil rights movement. There was no protesting of such issues at the Special Warfare Center. We were strictly militarily focused on military issues. Well, that was until the Detroit riots broke out. But that's another story. One collection of black lieutenants did approach me after a series of my classes at the Special Warfare Center on strategies for engaging indigenous populations in the support of the objectives of military operatives in countries engaged in insurgent, counterinsurgent warfare. They speculated that the U.S. military was not going to employ the strategies I had been presenting to them. The mainstream Army was going to continue to follow its search and destroy focus. However, when the lieutenants completed their time in the Army, they planned to return to their communities and implement the strategies to promote civil rights. That helped me feel like I might not be as disconnected from the reality of what was happening in the civilian world as I had thought. The first elementary principal I met was a middle-aged man who was full of beaming joy. He greeted me like a long-lost friend. There were lots of children in his school that I could help by evaluating their problems and coming up with recommendations for his teachers to follow. He wanted me to keep him informed of everything I was doing in his school. However, he did not want me to hold back on initiating something just because I had not met with him. He just wanted to be informed as soon as was reasonable for both of us. If it could be arranged, he would like for me to be at his school every day, he said with a big laugh. As soon as possible, I was to introduce myself to his teachers and do just what I could to help them. He sure made me feel needed, valued, and welcomed. The next elementary school principal I went to meet was different. I explained to the secretary in the front office who I was and that I would like to meet with the principal to receive his directions. She told me to take a seat on the adult side of the small office space. There were several women taking up most of the seats on that side. I assumed that they were all teachers. Small black children with very sad expressions occupied the chairs against the opposite wall of the room. Abruptly, the door to the principal's office opens. A teacher walks briskly out of his office, past the secretary, and down the building's hallway without a sideward glance. Her expression was blank. The principal appeared in his doorway. He looked directly at me. Turning to the child sitting closest to his door, he motioned for the little boy to enter the office. The child looked to be a first or second grader. As the child entered the principal's office, the principal again glanced my way before slamming the door shut. A few seconds of silence passed before I heard a muffled paddling sound. 1, 2, 3, 4 pops, and silence, except for the muffled sound of suppressed crying. Quickly, the door opened. The teary-eyed child walked in a disoriented manner to the exit door, struggling to suppress his crying. The principal glared at me. Turning to a teacher sitting beside me, he motioned her into his office. After a few minutes, the teacher exited his office and walked into the school hallway with the same blank expression as the first teacher I had observed leaving that office. He motioned to another little black boy. The child entered his office. The principal closed the door. Again, the 3 or 4 paddle smacks on a child's body could be heard. This time the child cried out at each impact of the paddle. The principal's door opened. The child had tears streaming down his face as he walked to the exit door. The principal glared at me. He called another teacher into his office. When she left, the principal called another child in and paddled him. Without fail, the principal never missed an opportunity to glare at me. This ritual repeated itself several more times before the principal called the secretary into his office. When she returned to the receptions area, she told me that the principal was too busy to meet with me. I would have to come back some other day if I wanted to meet with him. Thanking her for the information, I gave her my schedule for being at the school and stated that I would introduce myself to some of the teachers for the rest of the day. She said that was fine. That was that. Several of this school's teachers wanted to refer children to me for testing. That pleased me. Parent permission forms were made available and the paperwork process was underway. I continued to try to meet with this elementary school principal on my scheduled day at the school. It was always the same ritual. I would wait in the reception area as he called a teacher into his office, and when she left, he would call a child in to be paddled. At every opportunity that presented itself, he glared at me. Ultimately, I would get tired of waiting. There were teachers who wanted children tested, wanted to discuss classroom management issues, or simply desired to use me as a sounding board as they expressed ideas they wanted to try on children who simply were not learning the lessons being taught. After a month or so of the principal refusing to meet with me, I decided that I would meet with him. If necessary, I would sit in his office all day. I was not going to leave until he met with me. Arriving at his office as soon as it was unlocked, I watched him enter his room and close the door. He called the secretary into it. When she returned, she informed me that he would be too busy to meet with me that day. I informed her that it was okay. I would wait as long as it took until he was free. She went back into his office to tell him what I had said, to return to inform me that he would not meet with me. I explained that I would wait in the reception area until he was able to meet with me. The ritual of calling a teacher into his office, glaring at me, paddling a child, glaring at me, and calling another teacher into his office lasted until the end of the day. After most of the teachers had left the school that afternoon, the principal finally opened his door, pointed at me, and motioned for me to enter. As I walked through his open doorway, he slammed the door shut and began shouting at me, "I know why you are here. You are no damn good. You're the worst school psychologist this white school system has. If you weren't, they would have kept you in the white schools. I don't care what you do. You can just not show up at my school on your scheduled day. You can stay home and sleep. Just keep out of my sight. Now get out of here." "Sir, I can't do that," I calmly replied. "I'm scheduled to be in your school, and I will be here on time and all day. I will work with any teacher who asks me to do so. My work with your children will have to be my credentials. I intend to prove to you that I can and am helping your children. Thank you for your time today." With that, I turned and left his office. The one female principal was an elementary school principal. She was hard to read. While being properly polite, she seemed distant and reserved. I was allowed to work with her teachers. She would let me know when she needed to confer with me. The junior high school principal turned me over to his guidance counselors. There were 4 or 5 or 6 of them. There was about an equal number of men and women in the group. Naturally, they were all black. I found every one of them to be an excellent educator. They were truly committed to helping their students and the teaching staff. It was an inspirational experience to work with them. I considered their school my home base. We developed several innovative programs together during the 2 years I had the privilege of working with them. The high school principal also turned me over to his counselors. They didn't see much of a need for me to spend a scheduled amount of time in their school. Their consensus was that my services would be better utilized with the younger children. By the time the students entered high school, they were set in their ways. The students with the most serious problems in elementary school had dropped out of school before they were old enough to attend high school. If something came up in which they thought I could be of assistance, they would let me know. A few situations did arise during the 2 years in the system that enabled me to provide assistance to the school. The paddling principal and I gained a degree of understanding of each other and a level of mutual respect. At one point late in that first year, he called me into his office. He thanked me for making a difference for some of his children and assisting his teachers to be more supportive of the children. He particularly liked the positive atmosphere the teachers I had worked with displayed toward their students. He went on to explain that the reason he was so hard on the little children, the reason he paddled them for the smallest infractions, was because the white people in St. Petersburg were so cruel to blacks. In order to prepare the children for that cruelty, he had to toughen them up to be able to cope with the hostility of the whites. It was the only thing one could do to prepare them for life as black people in this reality of white supremacy. I was touched by the sadness in him as he explained himself. What a burden he carried. He loved the children. He wanted to prepare them for the harshness of the world he was experiencing. In his mind, he had to be cruel to the children in order to save them. I was sad for him, the children, and the teachers. By the end of the school year, he was rewarding the best behaved class in the lunchroom for the week with a Friday afternoon ice cream party. Neither he nor I were prepared for what would happen in his school the following year. The warm, welcoming principal evolved into one of the strongest supporters of positive behavioral management strategies in the classroom that I had. He never stopped leading the school in morning prayer, despite national news coverage of legal action against this practice. By the end of our first year of working together, he had almost completely stopped paddling children.